Somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, in the dead of night, a formation of aircraft that most people will never see with their own eyes lifted off from American soil and began flying toward the other side of the planet. No press conference, no warning, no countdown, just engines, fuel, and 37 hours of silence before the world would understand what had just happened. What followed became one of the most consequential military operations of the decade, and it centers on a weapon so specialized, so terrifyingly precise, that most militaries on Earth don't even have one. This is the story of how the United States used bunker buster bombs against Iran, why it happened, what these weapons actually do, and why the shockwaves from this decision are still being felt today. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to go back further than the headlines. Iran's nuclear program did not start in 2025. It stretches back decades through periods of secrecy, negotiation, sanctions, and international suspicion. For years, the world watched Iran build up its uranium enrichment capacity, particularly at a site called Fordo, buried deep inside a mountain near the holy city of Qom. This wasn't some ordinary facility sitting out in the open where a single missile could take it out. Fordo was built specifically to survive an attack. Engineers designed it to sit dozens of meters beneath solid rock, protected by layers of stone and reinforced concrete that conventional weapons simply could not reach. For a long time, that made it almost untouchable. Israel had the intelligence. Israel had the motivation. But Israel did not have a weapon capable of physically punching through that much rock. Only one country did. In June of 2025, tensions that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. Israel launched a sweeping military operation against Iran, hitting nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, and senior commanders in a campaign that came to be known as Operation Rising Lion. In a matter of hours, Israeli fighter jets struck more than 100 targets across Iran, taking out top military leadership, including the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the chief of staff of Iran's armed forces. Nuclear scientists were killed. Air defenses were degraded. It was a stunning display of precision and reach. But even with all of that firepower, Israel ran into the same wall everyone had run into before. Fordo was still standing, buried under that mountain, essentially untouched. For over a week, the fighting escalated. Missiles flew in both directions. Air raid sirens became a nightly routine in Israeli cities, and the world held its breath waiting to see whether the United States would step into a war it had spent months trying to avoid through diplomacy. President Trump had actually asked Israel to hold off on strikes so his administration could pursue a new nuclear agreement with Tehran. But when those negotiations stalled and Iran pushed forward with enrichment anyway, the calculus changed. On June 21, 2025, the United States crossed a threshold that no American president had crossed before. It directly struck another country's nuclear program. The operation was called Midnight Hammer, and it remains one of the most technically demanding airstrikes in modern military history. 6 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, flying from bases inside the United States, made the long journey across the globe, refueling in midair multiple times, all while maintaining total radio silence and stealth profiles designed to keep them invisible to radar. These aircraft are not small. They're flying wings worth over $1 billion each, built specifically to slip past enemy air defenses undetected. And on this night, their target was Fordo. Each B-2 can carry 2 of the weapons that made this mission possible. The GBU-57, officially known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. This is not a bomb in the way most people imagine a bomb. It's a 14,000 kilogram, 20,000 pound steel monster, longer than a school bus, engineered for one specific purpose: to punch through layers of reinforced concrete and solid rock before detonating deep underground. Most bombs explode on impact or shortly after. The Massive Ordnance Penetrator is different. Its thick steel casing is designed to survive the violent shock of slamming into rock at incredible speed without breaking apart, allowing it to drill dozens of meters into the earth before its delay-fused warhead finally goes off. The idea is brutally simple. You don't need to blow up the mountain. You need to get the bomb inside the mountain and then let physics do the rest. On that night, the B-2 bombers dropped 12 of these Massive Ordnance Penetrators on Fordo alone, with additional strikes hitting Natanz and Isfahan, 2 other critical pieces of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy submarines launched a barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles at Isfahan as a secondary strike option, since even the Massive Ordnance Penetrator has limits, and some of Isfahan's underground structures were believed to run deeper than even America's most powerful conventional bomb could reliably reach. The entire strike window lasted only about 25 minutes. 25 minutes to execute a mission that had been planned in total secrecy, using aircraft that had to fly halfway around the world, refuel multiple times, and hit 3 separate targets with pinpoint accuracy, all without being detected until the bombs were already falling. When Trump addressed the nation afterward, he described the strikes as having obliterated Iran's nuclear capability, a phrase that would later become the center of enormous controversy. Because here's the thing about bunker busters. Even when they work exactly as designed, it's incredibly hard to know from the outside exactly how much damage they actually did. You can't just walk into a bombed nuclear facility the next morning and take photos. The assessments that followed were messy, contradictory, and in some cases deeply consequential for how the public understood what had actually happened. U.S. Officials initially stated that all 3 sites sustained what they called extremely severe damage, and that Natanz in particular had effectively been destroyed. But then a leaked preliminary intelligence report from the Defense Intelligence Agency told a very different story. That early assessment suggested the strikes had damaged the facilities, but not fully destroyed the core equipment, and that Iran's nuclear timeline had only been set back by a matter of months, not years. Israeli intelligence reportedly reached a similar conclusion, that while significant damage had been done, Iran's program had not been eliminated. Iran's own government, predictably, downplayed the impact, initially describing the damage as only superficial. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the international body responsible for monitoring nuclear programs worldwide, took a middle position, describing the damage to the sites as enormous, without going quite as far as calling the program destroyed. So, you had at least 4 different narratives running simultaneously. The White House said obliterated, leaked intelligence said months, not years, Iran said barely a scratch, and the international watchdog said enormous but not definitive. This is one of the strange truths about warfare involving deeply buried targets. Even the people who drop the bombs often can't fully verify the results without getting boots on the ground or waiting for satellite imagery, seismic data, and radiation readings to slowly paint a clearer picture over the following weeks and months. What we do know is that in the immediate aftermath, Iran responded. On June 23rd, 2 days after the strikes, Iran launched missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, a major installation hosting American forces. But this retaliation came with an unusual twist. Iran reportedly gave advance warning to Qatar and the United States before the strike, and the attack itself, roughly 6 missiles, with only one reportedly making impact, caused no casualties. Many analysts interpreted this as a calculated face-saving move by Tehran, a retaliation loud enough to claim they struck back, but restrained enough to avoid triggering a full-scale war that Iran, weakened and battered, was in no position to fight. Just hours after that, President Trump announced on social media that Israel and Iran had agreed to a phased ceasefire, bringing what became known as the 12-day war to a close. For a moment, it looked like the crisis had been contained. Iran's nuclear ambitions had been set back, whether by years or months depending on who you asked, and a full regional war had been avoided. But the peace, as it turned out, was fragile. In the months that followed, tensions never fully disappeared. Iran suspended its cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency in early July, cutting off the very inspections that would have helped clarify how much of its nuclear program had actually survived. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies kept watching. And by February of 2026, alarm bells were ringing again. Trump himself began contradicting his earlier claims that the program had been obliterated, now stating publicly that Iran was already working to rebuild what had been destroyed. For an administration that had spent months celebrating a decisive victory, this was a significant reversal, and it set the stage for what came next. Later that same month, a new and even more dangerous chapter began. What's now referred to as the 2026 Iran War erupted, once again justified by concerns over Iran's nuclear rebuilding efforts. This time, the fighting reached further and pulled in more of the region than before. Just 2 days before the new wave of strikes began, high-level nuclear talks between the United States and Iran had taken place in Geneva, mediated by Oman. They had ended without any breakthrough. Diplomacy had failed again, and when the bombs started falling this time, they didn't stay confined to Iran alone. Iran's response to the second wave was far broader and far more aggressive than what followed the 2025 strikes. Missile and airstrikes were reported not just inside Israel, but across Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq. The entire Gulf region, an area responsible for a massive share of the world's oil production, was suddenly a live combat zone. This is where the bunker buster bombs entered the story again, but this time in a different form. In March of 2026, U.S. Central Command announced that American forces had struck Iranian anti-ship missile sites positioned along the coastline near the Strait of Hormuz, using 5,000-pound bunker buster bombs known as the GBU-72. These are a different breed of penetrator weapon compared to the massive Fordo bombs. Smaller, more maneuverable, and able to be carried by a wider range of aircraft, the GBU-72 is still a deep penetrator weapon, designed to punch through hardened targets before detonating. Central Command explained that these Iranian missile sites posed a direct threat to international shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which happens to be one of the most critical waterways on the planet. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's crude oil supply moves through that narrow channel. When Iran began threatening tankers and shipping traffic largely ground to a halt through the strait, oil prices didn't just react, they spiked by more than 40%. This wasn't an abstract geopolitical story happening far away anymore. It was hitting fuel prices, shipping costs, and global markets in a way that ordinary people around the world could actually feel. Around the same period, additional strikes hit an ammunition depot in Isfahan, a city that had already been targeted back in 2025 due to its role as a hub for Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure. Footage shared publicly showed massive fireballs and secondary explosions rippling through the depot, a visual signature consistent with a facility storing large quantities of munitions or sensitive material catching a chain reaction. Reports suggested this depot may have contained enriched uranium stockpiles, which, if accurate, would make it one of the most sensitive targets struck throughout the entire conflict. As the campaign expanded, so did the scale of American involvement. Reports indicated the United States began flying an increasing number of bomber missions out of a base in the United Kingdom, with nearly 24 American bombers stationed there taking part in the operation. This drew significant political friction. The British Prime Minister publicly stated that the UK was not participating in America's war against Iran, even as American aircraft were visibly launching missions from British territory. It's a good example of how modern coalition politics can get messy fast, allies trying to maintain public distance from a conflict while their own soil is quietly being used to help wage it. There were also reports during this period of even more extreme weaponry being discussed or deployed, references to what's sometimes nicknamed the mother of all bombs being used against an underground IRGC command complex near Tehran, deployed via B-2 bombers in a mission described by one military official as bringing hellfire down on the target. Whether every detail of these secondary strikes gets confirmed publicly or stays classified for years, the pattern is clear. This wasn't a single dramatic night like Midnight Hammer. This became a sustained, evolving campaign, with bunker buster weapons being used again and again against buried, hardened Iranian targets across multiple strikes throughout 2025 and into 2026. So let's step back for a second and talk about why this weapon specifically has become such a defining symbol of this entire conflict. Bunker buster bombs exist because modern warfare shifted underground decades ago. Once countries realized that surface facilities could be spotted by satellites and destroyed by missiles, they started burying the things that mattered most: command centers, weapon storage, and yes, nuclear enrichment facilities, deep beneath mountains and reinforced bunkers. This created a very specific military problem. How do you destroy something you literally cannot see, buried under dozens of meters of solid rock, without using a nuclear weapon yourself? The answer engineers arrived at was kinetic penetration. Instead of relying purely on the size of an explosion, you rely on speed, mass, and a hardened steel casing to physically drill into the earth before the explosive charge ever goes off. It's less like blowing something up and more like burying a giant steel spear at hypersonic speed and letting the payload finish the job once it's already inside. The massive ordnance penetrator represents the absolute pinnacle of this technology. It was specifically developed by the United States for scenarios exactly like Fordo, a facility so deep that virtually nothing else in the American or Israeli arsenal could reach it. Only a handful of these weapons exist in the world's stockpiles, reportedly around 20 at the time of the 2025 strikes, and only the American B-2 bomber has historically been certified to carry and deploy them, which is precisely why Israel, despite years of wanting to strike Fordo itself, physically could not do it alone. This single fact shaped the entire trajectory of the conflict. Israel could soften the target, take out air defenses, eliminate leadership, and strike everything else in Iran's arsenal, but the final blow against the country's most protected nuclear facility required American hardware and American pilots, which meant it required an American political decision. That's really the deeper story buried underneath all the technical specifications and explosion footage. This wasn't just about bombs, it was about the immense responsibility that comes with being the only country on Earth capable of ending a standoff that everyone else was powerless to finish. When Trump made the call to authorize Midnight Hammer, he wasn't just ordering an airstrike. He was making the first decision by any American president in history to directly attack another nation's nuclear infrastructure. That's a historic first, and it's the kind of decision that will be studied, debated, and second-guessed for decades, regardless of how effective the strikes actually turned out to be. And that effectiveness question still hasn't been fully answered, even now. The gap between what officials claimed in the moment and what leaked intelligence reports suggested afterward is a reminder that war, especially modern war, involving deeply buried, heavily classified targets, rarely gives you a clean, immediate verdict. You don't get to see inside Fordo. You don't get satellite footage of exactly which centrifuges survived and which didn't. You get seismic readings, seismographs picking up the underground shock waves, radiation sensors watching for leaks, months of quiet intelligence gathering, and eventually maybe a clearer picture. In the meantime, the public gets competing headlines. Obliterated according to one source, only delayed by months according to another. Both can be technically defensible interpretations of incomplete information, and that ambiguity itself becomes a kind of weapon in the information war that runs parallel to the physical one. What makes this entire saga even more remarkable is how quickly things escalated again after that first ceasefire in June 2025. For a brief window, it looked like a serious regional catastrophe had been narrowly avoided. A 12-day war, contained, ended, both sides claiming some form of victory. But the underlying tension, Iran's nuclear ambitions on one side and Israeli and American determination to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran on the other, never actually went away. It just went quiet for a few months before boiling back over into something even larger by February 2026, with strikes rippling out across Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Iraq, and oil markets absorbing shocks that rippled through economies far beyond the Middle East. This is ultimately why a single video title like this one matters so much. It's not just about one bomb, one night, or one target. It's about a chain reaction that started with a decision to strike a mountain in Iran and ended up reshaping oil prices worldwide, testing alliances between the United States and countries like the United Kingdom, and forcing an entire region to live under the threat of renewed conflict at any moment. The bunker-buster bomb itself is almost a supporting character in a much bigger story about how far a country will go to prevent a rival from crossing a nuclear threshold, and how those decisions ripple outward in ways that are nearly impossible to fully contain once they're set in motion. As of now, the situation remains fluid. Diplomatic talks have started and stalled multiple times. Ceasefires have been announced and then tested by renewed strikes within weeks or months. Analysts continue to debate whether Iran's nuclear program has been set back by years, by months, or whether it's already quietly rebuilding in ways the world won't fully understand until the next crisis forces everything back into the open. What is certain is that the massive ordnance penetrator and its smaller cousin, the GBU-72, are no longer just theoretical weapons discussed in defense journals and military briefings. They've now been used in real combat, against real targets, with consequences that are still unfolding in real time. Let's talk for a moment about the human side of a mission like Midnight Hammer, because it's easy to get lost in specs and tonnage and forget that real people flew those planes. The pilots who flew the B-2s that night were in the air for well over 30 hours round trip. Think about that. 30 hours strapped into a cockpit, refueling multiple times mid-flight from tanker aircraft, maintaining total radio discipline, knowing that a single mistake, a single moment of detection could turn a stealth mission into an international incident or worse. These aircraft cost over $1 billion apiece, and there are only 20 of them in the entire United States fleet. Losing even one, especially over hostile territory, would have been an enormous strategic and political blow. So every part of this mission had to be executed with near-perfect precision, timed down to the minute, coordinated across multiple branches of the military, the Air Force flying the bombers, the Navy launching submarine-based cruise missiles as a secondary strike option, all converging on 3 separate targets within the same narrow window. And here's something that often gets lost in the noise: decoy operations. Reports later emerged that the mission involved deception tactics designed to draw attention away from the real strike package. Other aircraft flying diversionary routes to confuse any early warning systems, watching American airspace and international flight patterns. In an age where flight tracking enthusiasts can watch military aircraft movements online in near real time, keeping a mission like this secret required a level of operational planning that goes far beyond just building a big bomb. It required controlling the entire information environment surrounding the mission, right up until the moment the weapons were already falling. Now, let's dig a little deeper into why Fordo specifically became such an obsession for military planners. This wasn't a random facility. It was purpose-built to be a worst-case scenario for any adversary trying to destroy it. Constructed inside a mountain near Qom, with some estimates placing key structures as deep as 80 or 90 meters underground, Fordo was engineered from the ground up with the assumption that someone, someday, would try to bomb it. Iranian engineers didn't just dig a hole and pour concrete. They studied exactly what conventional bunker busters were capable of and built beyond that threshold, layering rock and reinforced material to a depth that even America's most powerful non-nuclear weapon might struggle to fully penetrate. That's part of why, even after the strikes, there was so much uncertainty about whether the deepest and most sensitive equipment inside had actually been destroyed or simply buried under rubble, waiting to potentially be dug out and repaired later. This is also why Isfahan was treated differently during the original 2025 strikes. According to the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, bunker busters were deliberately not used against one section of the Isfahan complex, specifically because military planners assessed the facility was buried so deep that the massive ordnance penetrator likely wouldn't have been effective there anyway. Instead, that portion of the site was targeted with submarine-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, a decision that later became the subject of congressional questioning, since Isfahan was believed to house a significant percentage of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. It's a striking admission from the top of the American military chain of command. Even with the most advanced bunker buster in the world, there are still limits to what can physically be destroyed from the air, and commanders had to make real-time judgment calls about which targets were even worth risking a strike on. Beyond the battlefield, the economic ripple effects of this entire saga deserve their own spotlight. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just some line on a map. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most important choke points in the entire global economy. When Iran began threatening tankers and shipping activity ground to a near standstill in early 2026, the effects were immediate and global. Oil prices didn't drift upward gently. They spiked by more than 40% in a very short window. That kind of shock touches everything. Gas prices at your local pump, airline ticket costs, shipping fees on the packages you order online, and inflation pressures on economies thousands of miles away from the actual conflict. This is part of why bunker buster strikes near Hormuz carried such enormous weight beyond their immediate military objective. Taking out Iranian anti-ship missile sites wasn't just about protecting warships. It was about protecting the arteries of global trade itself. There's also a fascinating diplomatic subplot running underneath all of this. Throughout the conflict, Gulf allies were reportedly making private appeals to the Trump administration, urging the United States to keep pressing the fight against Iran rather than backing off. At the same time, publicly, several of those same allies were extremely careful about how they positioned themselves. Wary of being seen as co-belligerents in a war against a powerful neighbor they'd have to keep living next to long after the bombs stopped falling. This tension between private encouragement and public caution is incredibly common in coalition warfare, but it rarely gets discussed as openly as it did during this particular crisis, especially once reports surfaced about American bombers operating out of British bases while the UK's own Prime Minister publicly distanced his country from the operation. So where does that leave things today? The honest answer is still unresolved. Ceasefires in this conflict have proven fragile at best. Diplomatic talks in Geneva collapsed without a breakthrough right before the 2026 escalation began. Iran suspended cooperation with international nuclear inspectors, cutting off one of the few reliable ways the outside world had of verifying just how much of its program actually survived the strikes. And even the American president, who once declared the nuclear program obliterated, later acknowledged publicly that Iran appeared to be rebuilding. That's not the language of a closed chapter. That's the language of a story still being written, one where the next headline about bunker busters over Iran could come at almost any time. If there's one thing this entire story proves, it's that in modern warfare, the deepest secrets don't always stay buried, even underneath a mountain, even reinforced by decades of engineering meant to keep them safe. Sometimes it just takes the right aircraft, the right weapon, and the right moment for everything hidden underground to come violently back to the surface. And if history over the past year has shown us anything, it's that this particular story is far from finished.